Welcome back. We understand we had a few sound difficulties during that last panel discussion, and hopefully we've fixed them all during that little break. So we're going to start our next segment with a video, and this video features Don Beatty, who's the general manager of W.M. Beatty & Associates, a forestry management company that has been recognized for their environmental stewardship, and he's going to give his perspective on the importance of sustainable forest management.
My name is Don Beatty. I'm with W.M. Beatty & Associates in Reading. We have a small forest consulting company there with 22 employees. We manage about 300,000 acres of private timberlands in the northeastern corner of the state. We like to think we practice sustainable forestry in management. We tend to look, because of the nature of our owners who are very forward-looking people and you know, environmentally attuned to what's going on around them as far as land use. We look at things more from a landscape basis instead of, you know, 40s at a time or an acre at a time. We try and figure out what are we trying to get long term as far as our forest stands, our wildlife habitats, our watersheds, and what have you. What is the best mix overall that works on these properties? I've always been a cheerleader of forestry and foresters in particular, in the sense that in my mind it's the only discipline that can take a mix of resources and manage them as together as a group. Frankly, my own belief is that good forestry is good business, and good forestry and good business can be good environmentally as far as the resources that we work on. It's impossible in a state as populous as California is to not consider the social context that you're practicing forestry in. And the idea is to find, basically, like I said, the best mix of things that maximizes all those values. To think that we're islands out there is a long way from the truth. We tend to look through the sustained yield plans at outputs, whether it's wildlife habitat or watershed values, timber. What we try not to do is maximize one to the detriment of the others. We're always looking for what is the best mix of things that we can do on a given piece of property. I think it's incumbent on us to do the best job we can as far as managing fuel loads and ladder fuels, because the more we can basically self-protect, the more prevention we can do, the less losses we're going to sustain. Fire is a large consideration that we build right into our basic management regime. It's our policy, both through our FSC certification and through our SYP, to reforest lands have been catastrophically damaged just as quickly as possible. We maintain a large seed bank in most of the seed zones that we manage forests in, so we can accomplish that. The advantage of reforesting quickly is your site does not lay vacant for very long. I think with the considerations we have now for climate change, the quicker we can get it back into trees that are sequestering carbon and storing carbon, as opposed to brush which sequesters and stores very little, the better off we all are. Climate is going to lead to a lot of changes in terms of what we do on the ground. I think with some of the things that Congress is considering now, that a lot of practice are going to be incentivized, which is a much better way to regulate forest practice and create forest benefits, is through an incentive-based system as opposed to one that's regulatory or prescriptive. The fact that landowners now, with recent actions by the ARB, can basically sell carbon. There's other chances to basically sell biomass, which gets into the fuel treatment thing. So things that create other streams and sources of revenue for a forest landowner it basically creates incentives for that forest to stay in forest and not be converted to other uses. And we all win that way because essentially forests are basically a free green belt.
Some more great examples of connecting the dots. And our next panel is going to talk a little bit more about connecting those dots and why it's important that we start undertaking projects that do just that, and why it's important now, what's driving us toward these changes. And this is an interesting panel because we have representatives from both industry and the environmental perspective, and as we know, they haven't always agreed in the past on land management practices and taking forest fuels out of the forests. And yet there's a lot that they can agree on, and we're going to hear more about that. Let me introduce the three of them. Collins Pine is represented by Forest Manager Jay Francis. Collins is a forest stewardship certified for-profit business that has been widely acknowledged for its environmental efforts, proving that what's good for the environment can also be good for the bottom line. Craig Thomas is the Executive Director of Sierra Forest Legacy. Sierra Forest Legacy is an environmental organization that has recognized that sustainable forest management can reduce the wildfire risk to the watershed and the forest, and that fire fuels removal can provide energy and provide an important funding source for additional management activities. And finally, our local government representative, Supervisor Richard Forrester with Amador County, has real-world experience in responding to the needs and interests of all parties with a stake in his community. So just as with panel one, I'm going to ask each of you a question. You'll have 3 to 5 minutes to respond to that first question, and then we'll have some questions for the whole group. So Jay, let's start with you. On your website, there is a quote from Zeth Zuckerman from Sierra Club magazine, and it says, "In 1941, the Collins-Almanor Forest held 1.5 billion board feet of timber, enough to build 150,000 homes. Loggers have since removed 1.7 billion board feet, but the forest has nearly as much wood as it had when logging began. All of it still immature forest that attracts bald eagles, ospreys, goshawks, and northern spotted owls." Now, the Sierra Club is not a traditional source of praise for a timber company. How have you been able to achieve this outcome, and why did your company decide that this was the right approach to take?
Well, if you mean the outcome of getting praise from the Sierra Club, we're proud of that, but I think you mean the outcome of being able to sustainably manage and harvest the lands. And of course, that quote was from a 1992 article, so the numbers have changed a little bit over the last 17 years. Currently, obviously, the original inventory number is still the same, 1.5 billion board feet. But currently, we have cumulatively harvested over 2.25 billion board feet, enough wood to build over 225,000 homes. And our current inventories show that we have about 1.6 billion board feet of standing inventory on the forest today. So truly, that's a testament to the sustainability of the forest if it's managed properly. This idea of sustainability came about back when Truman Collins, one of the Collins family members and the founder of the Chester operation, had a vision of sustainability long before it became popular. His idea was to harvest the interest, if you will, and not touch the principal on the account. And he hired a competent staff of forest professionals to ensure that that happened on the Collins-Almanor Forest, because he wanted this to be an opportunity for people to live and work in a community in perpetuity, and not only maintain the forest resource, but also maintain the community resource. As Steve Walensky had mentioned about the boom and bust cycles of the timber industry, Truman had witnessed that firsthand. And he wanted something different for this community in northeastern California. So he charged his foresters with developing a plan to find out how much the forest was growing, see what they could do to improve that, and make sure that we never harvested more than that. At the same time, Truman and the entire Collins family recognize the value and importance of the other resource values, the wildlife, the clean and water quantity and quality, soil productivity, aesthetics and recreation for the public to enjoy. So our goal is to try to manage the forest in such a way that we do maximize the timber resource without compromising any of those other values. And we do that through what I call intelligent forest management, recognizing that we have sound science that backs up our decisions. We're not afraid to try some new things and recognize that maybe we don't have all the answers currently today, but that shouldn't stop us from going out and trying things and see what works best. I think, unfortunately, we get in that mode of thinking that if we don't have all of the answers, that's a license for inaction, and it really isn't.
Great. So sticking with that theme of websites, Mr. Thomas, there's a bunch on your website about the economics and profitability of diameter and of biomass and small diameter wood utilization, which is not typical for an environmental organization. So what's that all about?
Well, Joan, it's you're right. It's not typical. I hope it's becoming more common and less atypical as time goes on. As folks saw in the White Mountain Stewardship Project video, it's a very strong collaboration effort that's been going on there for quite a while. The Northwest Forestry Coalition up in Spokane, the work the Wilderness Society has been doing in Oregon, work that we're doing in the Sierra Nevada, working with the CHIPS project that Steve mentioned in the previous panel, hopefully is becoming more commonplace. Because I think it's really time for environmental groups, and for ours back in 2005 when we stepped out and said, okay, if we all raise our hands and believe that forest restoration is important, then what does that mean? And what are we going to support? And as we were, in the 90s even, reading in the last 20 years of forestry research and fire research, it's all pointing at a huge portion of the fire hazard problem is the surface and ladder fuels and small tree components. It's a place where there's broad social agreement on that, I think, and it's in the research very clearly. And we started to look at that as totally consistent with our conservation goals of being able to treat that material to limit large uncharacteristic fire, to limit fragmentation, to better protect old growth forests, to better protect at-risk wildlife habitat. We decided that we need to step out more publicly and actually spend time, grant funding, and effort to try to build collaborative efforts around getting that area of broad agreement, the surface and ladder fuels and small tree components, better understood and have more of the management focus beyond that component, because we have such broad agreement and it contributes so much to the harm we see when we get large uncharacteristic fires happening. So it was in our interest from a conservation perspective to want to promote those elements so that we could get that work done and not lose those other values that we all are concerned about. So hopefully it's becoming less atypical and more commonplace that folks around, particularly in the West, there's an astounding figure that when we started to get into this to understand, well, how come there isn't a lot of biomass infrastructure in the Sierra Nevada? How come it's hard to get those components, the infrastructure, the workforce, the community stability focused around an area where there's such common agreement of what the problem is? And when you look at Europe, they're 20 years ahead of us in this. Communities all over Europe have small scale, generally small scale biomass utilization facilities going on. When we looked at New England, and I'll read this because it's astounding to me, 1993 survey of installations in the Northeast, 43 schools, 26 hospitals, 17 colleges, 22 greenhouses, not the ones in your backyard, but big horticulture facilities, 6 correctional institutions, and 20 commercial and industrial facilities were using biomass fuel in 1993. So if we could focus and achieve that sort of an outcome in, say, 3 regions in the Sierra Nevada, what a fantastic outcome that would be, that would drive the economics to get more of this work done. And as Steve mentioned, that with White Mountains, there's very little conflict around what's happening there. The environmental community is in the middle of it, and it's targeting the place where everyone agrees where the problem is, and it's building economic solutions around that problem rather than creating more problems.
Supervisor Forrester, you represent the local government perspective. What do you see as local government's role in sort of bringing this all together, connecting these dots of, you know, managing forest fuels and protecting the environment and having healthy forests? And what do you see as the obstacles to getting to getting that done?
The one thing we can't do anymore is just sit on our hands and pretend that things are going to go away. Some people have an issue with AB 32. Some people have an issue with climate change. Legislation has been passed. It's here. We must deal with the effects of it, and whether you agree or disagree doesn't matter anymore. Legislation is here, and local government has to react to it and try and make sure that we help create the resources to go into our national forests and make them healthy. National forests comprise a large part of all rural counties, and I'm going to speak on behalf of RCRC, Regional Council of Rural Counties at this point, but Amador County, over 40% of our county is publicly owned. Then go down to Inyo County, over 98% of Inyo County is publicly owned. We need to help create the resources, form those coalitions with U.S. Forest Service, with Sierra Nevada Conservancy, with BLM, with the local people within our area, with CAL FIRE. Everyone needs to work together. At this point, our Fire Safe Council is working with U.S. Forest Service and with CAL FIRE, very cooperative relationships, going out and getting those grant fundings. Our County Board of Supervisors supports their efforts, and you try to make it happen even in this economic environment, because sitting still and doing nothing is not an option anymore. We have too many people, and all rural counties have too many people that have moved out into the forest in that wildland-urban interface, and we need to get the projects on the ground to create the thinning, to create that community wildfire protection plan concept so that these people will not have, one, it's an economic issue. We've had people last year that had their insurance canceled because the projects were not done timely, and some of those were able to get them reinstated after the projects were done. So it's an economic issue, it's a social issue, it's an environmental issue. People come to our county, and I just participated in a visioning with Amador Council on Tourism this week. 2 reasons people come to our county: scenery, the mountain landscapes. The other is for recreation. They want to go swimming and clean lakes that have pure water, and if we let our forest burn, and that's essentially what we're doing if we sit on our hands, don't participate in these programs with our partners out there, and we need to bring in the environmental community and talk to them. We just can't sit still and believe that they're on that side, we're on this side. We have to open the dialogue. We have to come up with the alternatives, going in and thinning, going after the small diameter trees that are in there, clearing the underbrush. If we can do that, if we can create that environment, then we're helping our whole county and every rural county, because if we have that clean water, that supply, if we have an ecosystem that has a healthy watershed so that we can supply our residents with water, in our case out of the McCallamy River, if we can create the carbon sequestration, if we can create the products that come out due to the thinning, then we can supply our biomass plant. The Buena Vista biomass plant in Ione just got off the ground. The other role the government can take is supporting those efforts. When the Buena Vista biomass plant came in, they said we can apply for federal dollars through stimulus. We need your support. That's government's role, is to get to our federal leaders, use our federal lobbyists in Washington to support those efforts so that a plant can get off the ground, so we can employ people, so we have healthy forests, creates healthy tourism. Just the synergy is there to create the economic environment, social well-being, and the environmental aspects all feed off that.
So you started to address this, which is why do we need to do this? What are the imperatives? What's to lose if we just keep on with business as usual? Can you guys talk a little bit more about that?
Well, we have to recognize that California is a state that has over 30 million acres of forest lands. And as Richard said, a lot of that in the Sierras is public lands. I'm from Plumas County, where over 90% of our county is public lands. We've, in the last decade, seen the results of inaction in these tremendous catastrophic wildfires that are much larger than we've ever seen historically. And it's pretty simple. I'm not a real intelligent guy. I say I'm a dumb forester, but I think anybody can understand that if we grow a resource for a number of years and we don't do anything with it, something is going to happen. So we can either remove that material and use it for our benefit and protect the environment, or we're going to see it burn up. So that's why I think it's important that we do something.
I have to chuckle at his comment, his self-deprecation there, because when we are lobbying folks talking about what industrial forestry models can look like, we use photographs from the Collins Pine ownership to talk to people about here's an option of production forestry that's sustainable, that looks like a forest when it's been, after it's been treated, it has all the components remaining that we're interested in, and it still produces a lot of wood volume. So he's sharper than he wants to admit, I think.
And Collins Pine has the model. I hope that other businesses that own lots of land that are private in the Sierra Nevadas will look at Collins Pine, will revise their operating models. You can't do business as usual as it was in the past. And I realize they have a few bruises because they harvested everything they want to before. They did clear cutting. They did lots of things that aren't acceptable now. But on the other hand, they didn't go in and look at what other things can we do. They weren't trying to be creative. They weren't revising their profit motives and figuring out what else can we do, what's going to happen in 10 years down the road. They kind of took that old adage off that tobacco, ironically, the tobacco commercial that I'd rather fight than switch. Well, I think fighting is not working, so we need to bring together all the parties and make it work so that we can go in, we can thin our forests, and if we don't do that, the electric fire that happened in Amador County just this last year, the only thing that stopped that from becoming a catastrophic fire was a fuel break project that was done. The power fire several years ago in Amador County, for 3 weeks, we didn't have visitors coming in Amador County because they couldn't breathe, and it affected the whole valley floor. So if we don't take those actions, it doesn't just affect Amador County, it affects all of the counties that are near us, and it happens throughout the state.
From our perspective, an additional issue is that we've spent a huge amount of time and money over the last 15 years working on the conservation of the Pacific fisher, which is a small forest carnivore that runs around and is strongly associated with old forests. They're limited to roughly 5 small isolated populations in the southern Sierra. If we don't get fire resiliency built back into those forests, any significant big fire in there is going to blow out and de-link those populations, and they're gone. So those kinds of issues for us put us in that position of saying, so what are we going to do? And part of what we need to do is to build fire resiliency through the utilization of some of this material and getting appropriate fire back in those landscapes and the inappropriate levels of materials that are there out of those landscapes carefully, sustainably. But it's a big ticket item for us because fire hits those places, we lose a whole bunch of values besides the harm to people and watersheds.
Well, there's another interesting quote on the Collins website. You're chock full of interesting quotes. This one is from Mahatma Gandhi, and it's, "If you want to change, you must be the change. No excuses or apologies, no blaming governments or bureaucracies. Change is manifested one person at a time, one choice at a time. It happens because we are willing to embrace a vision that is larger than our own self-interests." I think that last part was added by the Collins folks. Do you all agree that embracing a vision that is larger than our own self-interests is the key to success here? And if so, how do we convince others to embrace that larger vision?
You keep talking to them, because we still have people in our county, and I'm sure it's like this around the state, that can't sit down at the same table. You know, my perspective is, even if I disagree with someone, I want to sit down so they understand my point of view, I understand theirs. We may find some commonalities. I'm not sure if it's going to be the 90% that was pointed out earlier, but you have to start someplace. And if you just shun someone, not want to talk to them, that's not the way to do it.
That works for all sorts of interests in these situations, and it's real easy to operate from the bunker and not really open the door and go knock on the door of that other party and try to see where you can get in terms of a shared restoration vision. And what we've been trying to do is to move these mutually held values together and move them forward. So owning the other person's interests is really critical to that, and have your interests owned by them and try to move that forward. And I'm not talking about some simplistic cutting the baby in half or reducing everything down to a low common denominator that is ecologically unsound and economically flawed. I'm talking about moving a very positive, proactive vision forward that benefits all of us and gets those things that we all share together. And I think that shared vision is the place to really spend a lot of time and work. And you know, now what we've run into in some of these projects, like with working with Steve Walensky and others, is that there's a coalition that has inertia and energy to want to continue to bust through some of these barriers and solve some of these problems. You build trust over time. In the White Mountains, they've started out at a fairly small scale, and the mutual interests that are now shared, they're looking at treating 1 million acres over 20 years, and now they're back in a facilitated situation, working out the bumps they've run into to get to that next level. And that level would have never happened if they hadn't started at a smaller level where they could reach baseline agreements. So it's sharing those interests and trying to work together that way.
And I would agree with both Richard and Craig in that you have to talk with folks. And it's interesting, I've had conversations with folks on the telephone, and we seem like we're 180 degrees apart. When I invite folks to the woods and we can get out and kick some dirt, it's amazing how much agreement we have in our shared vision. And I think that's what Craig was talking about. And I commend Craig for actually reaching out to me and calling me a few months ago and saying, hey, there's a project we want to take a look at. Let's see where we have some agreement, where we have some disagreement. What can we do to make this better? And I think it's efforts like that that will work in the long run.
And what do you all think is the role of the federal and state government in addressing this historic conflict and facilitating changes in land management and utilization of biomass? Are there policy changes that need to be made at the federal, state levels, or even at the local levels to make that happen?
Absolutely there are, but I really have to commend Randy Moore for coming in, and the whole attitude of the federal government towards what you do in our forest now, how you want our forest to be sustainable and productive forest, that the whole attitude has changed now. One thing we're looking at is there needs to be policy created to make that National Forest Community Wildfire Prevention Plan. There's the local side, but there's not the federal side yet. We're making inroads to get that done. Where that matters is when you come up against the wildland-urban interface, is it doesn't do us any good to create that zone of defensible space if you run right into a national forest where nothing is done. So if we can work collaboratively and try to get those strides in place, then I think we're making a big effort. And U.S. Forest Service, CAL FIRE's been a great partner. Sierra Nevada Conservancy obviously has been out there and doing their work on the ground. Unfortunately, Governor Schwarzenegger gets all the awards.
And from the private industry side, I work more with the state organizations. And obviously, CAL FIRE has a responsibility of overseeing and protecting the state's interests in private lands. I'm really encouraged to see the direction that some of the regulatory agencies are going right now, recognizing that we have increased the burden regulations to the point where it's not giving folks a lot of options for getting good work done on the ground, and maybe the alternatives of either selling off the ground, subdividing it, turning it into subdivisions or a shopping center may be more attractive than going through the government regulations. I think you're going to hear later from a member of the Board of Forestry and Pam Giacomini about some of the things that I've witnessed her management committee doing at the State Board of Forestry, is working on a modified timber harvest plan to try to encourage folks to go out and do these types of projects that we're talking about without it being so costly to the individual landowner that it's a disincentive to try these projects. The National Forest, I was pleased to hear Randy Moore say this morning that they're trying to ramp up their efforts. Like I say, for too long, I think we've looked at not having every single potential answer firmly vetted out as a reason for doing nothing, and we can't afford to do that any longer, because the forest is not a static ecosystem. It's a living, breathing, changing organization, and we have to address that, or the consequences are going to be catastrophic, and that's what we're seeing these days.
I think we're all a part of the evolving West, and we're in a period of transition of trying to figure out how to move from one type of economic approach and ecological, approach to a landscape that I don't think was meshed well together, to evolving a new position for how we do business in terms of restoring these forests and having sustainable communities within them. I actually brought some biomass with me today, sitting on the table, which is this is a piece of densified wood here. And when we started to get a handle and understanding what kind of products are out there and what kind of infrastructure is necessary, one of the first things we realized was there isn't a lot in California, and trying to understand why is that? Why do we make no pellets and we import them from Oregon and elsewhere? How come California uses so much post and pole material in agriculture, but we don't make posts and poles in California? So, one of the major policy shifts is, needs to be much more emphasis on budgetary support, legislative support for ecologically and economically appropriate biomass utilization. And I think we're getting there. Forest Landscape Restoration Act is a new piece of legislation that's got a little funding behind it that demands that good science be at the table, demands that projects scale is fairly large, and that it targets this biomass problem that we've been talking about. I think we're headed there. And like I mentioned before, Europe, New England, and other places are ahead of the game, and we are now on that train of evolving into a new direction. And there's going to be bumps in the road. I think the other thing that I want to commend this region for, which is really critical in terms of trying to reduce the amount of conflict that goes into project design and the debate around projects, is a new general technical report that the region has sponsored as a result of conflict. They really brought together their research branch and had their direct input into the design and the desired conditions and the ecological integrity of Sierra Nevada mixed conifer forest, the main place we're talking about. And now this document we are using to promote a new way to dialogue and a new way to build projects that are going to find more acceptability out there on the landscape, that bring multiple values together at the same time, not trump card, who's got the power, who's got the biggest club, but assert and move forward multiple values. The region did that here as a result of some listening and some desire to bring their own scientific resources into the mix for when managers are trying to build decisions that are acceptable decisions socially. I think that's a huge piece of progress that we've seen the federal government via our Forest Service at the local level on the ground put in place. And I'm happy to say that was something we can claim in this region as a positive step forward.
In the Amador El Dorado, Forest Rangers had an open door policy to Buena Vista Biomass. They already have a process in place where they're going to be taking the slash out of the forest, so we won't have the air quality issues. It'll go down to the biomass plant. It'll be turned into clean energy, and there's a big benefit there for my district where the biomass plant sits, in that before they were burning lignite and other fuels, they even had within their permit the ability to burn tires. Can you imagine that the kind of pollutants that came off that? Well, now there's going to be about a 60% drop in any kind of emissions that come off that plant. It's going to be well supervised. It's just a win-win for everyone, for the environment, for the county, for the consumers.
So you're talking about biomass, you talked about pellets and post and pole. What are the opportunities for green jobs in Sierra communities, and what are the obstacles and some of the opportunities for getting us those jobs?
The one obstacle we see is good relationship between our Fire Safe Council and Forest Service and CAL FIRE. When you hit Sacramento, you hit kind of a bottleneck sometimes with the funding. Some of the grants that would have occurred 9 months ago sometimes may not materialize at all, or you get the money so late sometimes you don't see those direct benefits. So if we can fix that bottleneck, unfortunately a lot of that has to do with the state budget and federal budgets. We need to figure out where we're going to spend our money. Forest Service right now spends over $1 billion a year on fire suppression. California, millions and millions of dollars spent on fire suppression. Where would we rather see that spent? On going into our forests, on doing thinning efforts, community wildfire protection zones, or do we want to just keep doing the same thing we're doing? It sounds like kind of a broken model.
Yeah, you know, and it is important to focus because we've got this overabundance of small diameter wood, but I don't think we can neglect the traditional resource that our forests have provided in the form of saw logs too. We have a 94,000 acre forest that we've been managing on a sustainable basis for close to 70 years now. And I think it's important to realize that that beautiful forest that I take folks to and say, wow, this looks like, you know, a really neat thing you guys are doing here. For the first 50 years of our management, we didn't cut any trees less than 20 inches in diameter, but we did not liquidate that large diameter component, but we were growing other trees into that. And you know, I don't think we should be ashamed to say that forest resources provide a value that we can all use that to help with restoration and provide the good jobs, family wage jobs. The grant money that is out there is great to get some of these things started, but there should be nothing wrong, and we shouldn't apologize for using a resource that's renewable, that's clean, it's carbon friendly, it's sequestering more carbon, to help pay for some of this work that needs to be done in the forest and provide a sustainable community that goes along with it, if we do it in the proper manner, just like Don Beatty was showing on that video.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the issues that I like to engage people on is the construction of the equation, if you will, about how we talk about the incentives and the offsets, and in terms of what kinds of activities get funded and what kind of activities don't. And we're struggling to get biomass infrastructure and green jobs and more of that into our local communities. And you know, when I look at the opportunity for biomass utilization at the appropriate level to offset emissions and all the health costs and all the costs associated with emissions from an uncontrolled event, when you look at the opportunity for communities to control some of their local energy production, there's no, you know, it's getting cold here in the winter and we're all going to go home and turn on something to stay warm as the winter progresses, right? And the more of that is green energy derived, the better we're going to be. And yet so much of what people rely on still is fossil fuel consumption to heat their homes, to heat business parks, hospitals, you name it. And there's a place there for that green economy to supply fuels reduction material in the form of biomass to augment those facilities' heating systems or take them over totally. So there's the air emission costs, the fire suppression costs, the ability to control energy, carbon fuel offsets. All those things are a part of an equation that we're debating as a society right now about what do we value and where do we put our political support and our social values, and what kind of a world do we want to have. And I think there's a huge conversation there about, for one thing, the amount of money that gets poured into fire suppression compared to pre-suppression work. You know, if I had my way, half of the Forest Service budget would go to this gentleman in the audience over here, Bruce Goings, to work more on biomass utilization and rural community development focused around green jobs that integrate that needed fuels reduction work into those economies. And that's a place where I think we can go collaboratively with the Conservancy's help to try to promote that in the Sierra Nevada.
So you said the word incentives. In addition to funding, what kind of incentives do you think are needed from a local government perspective, an industry perspective, an environmental perspective? What kinds of additional incentives or disincentives need to be put in place to make this happen?
Incentive and subsidy, those are all charged words, so it gets everybody all stirred up. But in fact, to me, if there's a primary legitimate role of government, it's to promote the public good and to use tax dollars to help promote the public good. But as Jay said, we can't subsidize everything in the world and have it not have a freestanding component to it, too. So I think part of the role of government, part of the role of what happened with Forest Service interaction in the White Mountains was that support of a good idea, very concentrated, large dollar support for what looked like the best story they could see in a whole region in terms of people trying to work together. That is an appropriate role of government and a very good thing that they've done. So there's real value to that. And then when you start thinking about, well, if those fires aren't burning and those emissions aren't happening, then are we really rewarding those people, right, for all of that? Or are we just in a limited little box of, appropriations going to White Mountains, trees getting cut, economic activity there? Is it really an expanded equation for all of the benefits that happen when you've got clean water and clean air and suppression costs for fighting fires are going down, people are being employed locally, you're not trucking energy from the Alberta tar sands to heat a house in Sacramento, that you've got locally created wood pellets from fuels reduction work and thinning work that people are using in a controlled situation with less emissions. To me, those things need to be supported, whether it's incentive or their ability to stand alone. The incentive conversation, really, when you start looking at that equation, there's some interesting things for us all to work on there. Some mischief, a lot of politics, institutional power bases that want the world to remain as the status quo versus change. There's a lot we can do there to really re-identify those issues for people to understand them better.
And I think there's a huge opportunity for encouraging folks to go this direction. It was brought up in the last panel that we have the technology now and the understanding how to manufacture equipment to go out and do this sort of work. It's safer for the employees. It's better for the environment. Unfortunately, it's very expensive. No one wants to go out and sink a lot of money into this very expensive equipment if they don't know if they're going to have a job that will last more than this year. It takes multiple years to pay this equipment off. If we're only going to limit it to being able to work 2 or 3 months out of the year, no bank is going to finance equipment that can only work 2 or 3 months out of the year. So I think there's some opportunities to look at loosening up some of the regulations where it's not detrimental to the environment, to where we can operate longer in the season and do a better job with the equipment technology that we have out there. The other thing is some regulatory relief, both by the state and the federal government, to recognize we want to encourage this type of activity to be occurring out on the lands. And if we can do that, I think more people will come forward to try to do some of this work. We're fortunate in far north California that we still have at least a remnant infrastructure in place. In the southern Sierras, they're struggling with that. And even We saw a few years ago the devastation that occurred down around Lake Arrowhead in Southern California. There was no infrastructure in place to deal with this issue. So it would be good to encourage what we have and hopefully encourage more folks to get into that. But it's going to take some effort on the government's process to encourage folks to get in that. And whether that's tax incentives or regulatory relief are both very, I think, good incentives.
We hear regulatory relief a lot, complaints about that, and in this state we're overburdened with it. We have to try and adjust to the rules in place as best we can, but incentives is one place, local government. We can't keep asking the state and the feds, you fund it all the time. In our watershed for Amador County, it provides water for Amador, Calaveras, Alpine, and the predominant amount of water in our river goes down to East Bay Mud, Alameda, Contra Costa County. They should have a big part. Amador County should have a big part. Calaveras in providing funding to go into these efforts to get biomass out of the forest, to make our forest healthier, more sustainable. All of us have to commit some resources. And when you have the 800-pound gorilla of East Bay Mud in the picture, they should be willing, because water quality is cheaper for them if the water makes it to the East Bay in a more pristine state. They don't have to treat it. They don't have to spend as much money. Commit some of that dollars back up so that we can get the suppression efforts in place.
So if you had to offer advice to people who are contemplating taking on the kinds of projects that were presented in that first panel, what kind of advice would you give them? Anything?
Well, I think one thing, we all need to keep an open mind. You know, I remember the bumper sticker that says, you know, a mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open. But also to look at the science that we have available, and that's one of the advantages, I think, of this general technical report that Craig alluded to. They haven't really created any new science, but they've brought a lot of the existing science together. And we've heard for so long that, especially on the federal government side, this term of paralysis by analysis. We need to do more studies. Well, we've done the studies, and maybe we don't have 100% of the answers, but we've got 90 or 95% or 98%. Let's get to work. Let's take the information that we've accumulated over decades and go out and do what works. I would welcome folks to have input on these projects, but let's not try to just derail a project because it doesn't meet every single one of our goals.
I guess what I would offer as a fundamental starting point is to deal with this word sustainability, which is a very interesting word and gets bandied about by all of us, and we pass it by each other, assuming that we all think we know what that means. And we don't. And so it's really critical for any of these efforts where folks are trying to work together to sit down and talk about desired conditions. You talk about them economically in your community too, but talk about them also ecologically. What does it mean for an ecologically sustainable vision for a landscape? So it's critically important from our perspective to what does that word mean to people? What gets counted? And who does the counting is a huge issue. If you get past that one, you are a long ways down the road. If you want, you know, resilient forests that have diversity and heterogeneity, diversity basically, not uniformity, those issues need to be really well defined and talked about, and they're different from place to place. It's different where Jay lives from where I live to where the Southern Sierra, and the pieces are different and maybe operate differently. And then the processes of this, what do you want this thing to work like it used to work when we all thought it was resilient and healthy, or some other way? And get those things talked out, because that's, you know, then you start building a foundation to be able to work together, not have that be the last thing that you avoid talking about until the very end. Bring it up right away. And I think people will be surprised that there's more common ground there than I imagined And then you start moving together where you're not jettisoning a key community's interest just to get the thing done. You've got to bring it along together and bring all the people along together. That's how I recommend starting that sort of work.
And all of us are here because we have a common goal. We want to see healthy, sustainable forests. There are direct benefits to that. What I would say from a local government perspective is when people have an idea, do what Buena Vista Biomass did. Come in and talk to your local government. Don't just put down your list and talk to each one individually and X them off and say, okay, I talked to them. That's the end of it. They did a very comprehensive job of going into the community, meeting with the partners, and finding out the information. The local governments have that information, as Brett Story said. They're more than willing to share. Everyone here has been through different models of operation. They can share that. They can see what happened in Calaveras with the CHIPS project there. They're successful projects. We don't have to recreate the wheel. It doesn't mean you can't take a little spin on it, though, and do something different for it to be successful.
So I'm going to end with the same question I ended the last panel with. Is there anything else you're dying to say, something that you had in mind to tell us today that you haven't had an opportunity to talk about yet?
Well, I have something, and it's my staff brought this up to me, and this is something that those of you that know Bill Center, former supervisor in El Dorado County, neighbor of mine, who talk about a lot, is that when I looked out into the infrastructure setting, the economics of the communities where I live, and we're trying to find people out there we can talk to. And I can talk to Jay, and he's at the smaller end of the industrial forestry community. But we generally lost the middle in this economic setting. We've got a lot of little boutique, and we're always running into people. We just met a guy down in Tuolumne County. He's a Mennonite, and he's got a small sawmill in his barn, and he processes really beautiful custom wood. So there's a lot of those people that have real skill and talent. It's not so small to call it boutique, but it's pretty small scale production. And then we've got mega industrial production. We've lost most everything in the middle between those two. We need to rebuild that middle at the community level, at the ecologically and economically sustainable level. And that's where we want to spend our time, and we want to work with people to try to spend our time. The infrastructure, the resources, the processing ability to move and restore these forests and move some of that material into a better use than it's where it's headed right now. And we think there's a lot of room in that middle to work together to build the right kind of economic situations that are supportable by a wide range of people.
You know, it's interesting the times we're in, because it doesn't matter whether you want to talk about climate change or wildlife habitat or water production and quality. Everything is kind of pointing towards doing a good job of managing our Sierra Nevada forests. And I'm glad to see the agreement that we've got here today, and I hope that carries forward, because I think it's going to do nothing but benefit all of the people of California if we can reach some kind of an agreement and get out there and get some work done on the ground.
And none of us wants to see catastrophic wildfires like the Angora fire and others that have ravaged our state. So we need to be proactive. We need to form those partnerships and coalitions and get the job done now. It's time to stop sitting on our hands and go to work. And I think a lot of people are doing that already, but other people need to accept it. It's time.
Okay, great way to end. Thank you all very much.